Thanks everyone for tuning in to NCIA's official response to the USDA hemp comments. We look forward to presenting both an overview of the hemp rules as well as our public comments to provisions we find needing clarification and also potential change. So I'm gonna let Cindy kick it off. And Cindy.
Thanks, Alex, and thank you to NCIA for accommodating this webinar and allowing us the opportunity to jump in with some information on what the USDA hemp rules do and what we're working to do. Again, Alex, thank you for the introduction. My name is Cindy Sovine. I am the chair of NCIA's hemp committee, and Alex is an attorney who works in this industry who has spent a lot of time pouring and coming through the rules and regulations to really understand the impact that it's had. And for the last almost month and a half now since the rules were released, our committee has been going back and forth over a response to these rules. It is going to look much of what Alex has got, it will be presenting to you today. So really just want to take the opportunity to thank you for joining us. This is a really important issue for everyone to be involved in. It does not just affect farmers. Without farmers, there is no hemp, which affects everyone else in the supply chain. So it's really important for us all to have a strong foundation. And we really believe that that means having a strong and engaged industry. So with that, I want to kick it over to Alex and let him get going on what we've got. I know everybody's got a short window of time to join us, and we're grateful you're here.
Thanks, Cindy. So let's start off with a quick summary of the rules. So the Farm Bill was signed December 20th, 2018 by President Trump. It descheduled, it provided an exemption to the federal definition of marijuana in the Controlled Substances Act. So it descheduled the hemp plant, which is defined as cannabis that is below 0.3% Delta-9 THC. The original Farm Bill laid out statutory provisions. The USDA spent the last year, well, not quite a year, about 10 months, coming up with rules to effectuate those Farm Bill provisions. And the point of today is to highlight the important rules as well as the ones that we think need to be clarified or changed. So in terms of an overview, the first major issue that is brought up by the USDA is in the Farm Bill, it said that THC had to be tested using a decarboxylation method or similarly reliable method. So USDA has taken the position that that decarboxylation method needs to be used, and it includes THCA and not just Delta-9 THC in your total THC count. So when you're testing your hemp, it's no longer, if you're in a state like Oklahoma that's just Delta-9, it's no longer just Delta-9. It's your Delta-9 plus, I think it's 0.887 times your THCA. And the labs, it's the conversion, the decarboxylated conversion that happens in the labs. So when you start sending, or now that we're under this USDA program, it's of the utmost importance that it's not just Delta-9 THC you're looking at it in these COAs. When you're selecting seeds, selecting isolate, selecting distillate, whatever it is, it's total THC, and the USDA has made that very clear. In terms of sample collection requirements, they have not specified an exact method that will be used for the states. So states have some leeway in terms of how they sample. The issue is that the USDA said that all hemp had to be sampled within a state. And then it talks about a collective and representative sample of all hemp. So we have asked for clarification on whether that means, and this will go into our first public comment, we've asked for clarification on whether that means that all hemp, all registrants have to be sampled under a state plan, or whether, like in Colorado, a representative sampling can occur. So not every registrant has to be sampled. So we're still waiting, or we will be waiting for guidance and clarification on that. The Farm Bill kicked most of the regulation to the states, so it allows for either a state to implement its own regulations, to defer to the USDA regulations, or to keep hemp prohibited. Currently, 2 states have continued to keep hemp prohibited, and that's South Dakota and Idaho. Most of the other states, I believe, will regulate. So I'm not sure how many states are going to defer to the USDA plans, but with the principles of federalism in this country, most states like to have control of as much as they can have control over. So I would be very surprised to see a lot of states defer. I will say, I'll bring up these violations and penalties. There's two types of violations, and there's actually kind of a third type. So the third type is a non-violation, and it's what happens if you test above 0.3% THC and below 0.5% THC. And the USDA has kind of made a rule where that does not even result in a negligence violation. You just have to till your crop into the ground, or just use the CSA rules for destruction. So if you grow cannabis that's above 0.3 and below 0.5, currently under rule, you won't get a negligence violation. If it's between, once it's above 0.5, then it's prosecutorial discretion. And if you didn't mean to grow cannabis that was above 0.3%, then that would likely be a negligence violation. But if you were growing, marijuana and you're under the guise of hemp and it was 10% THC or above, or even if it was 5% and it looked like you were doing something shady and you weren't really trying to follow the rules to the T, that would be a more culpable violation, and those are serious, and they get reported to both the Attorney General and of the U.S. and the state in which the hemp was produced. And finally, there's a felony restriction in the Farm Bill. It is statutory, so USDA cannot get rid of it in rulemaking. And what it says is, if you were not in the industry producing hemp under a 2014 Farm Bill prior to the enactment of the 2018 Farm Bill, so that'll be December 20th, 2018, you cannot participate in the industry. USDA has actually gone and limited that a bit. They have limited that to key participants, but we'll discuss that a little bit later. And I'm going to turn it over to Cindy. I do see a question, and these slides will be distributed after the presentation. So don't feel like you need to screenshot them. They are text heavy though, because we're working through rules, and these are going to be the public comments we submit to USDA.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. I don't have a lot to add other than, at this point, we know that this is one of the biggest issues that we're hearing from farmers, from members, that, having these types of issues around not having flexibility and being able to move forward just literally creates a bottleneck in the industry. So I think this is really the time that we would like to see and have comments or questions around this particular issue. If any of you guys have it here on the call, on the webinar. Are there any questions about the felony restrictions or any of the violations and penalties, what they're proposing?
And I'll just move on to the next slide. But if you want to continue to submit questions throughout the presentation, we'll answer them in real time, just so we don't get too far down the road off topic before answering your questions. So we'll move on to the next slide here. So sampling is one of the largest issues we see, because under the USDA rules, if read one way, it makes Colorado's random sampling program unlawful. And it's not just Colorado that does random sampling. It actually wouldn't, even if it was read to allow for not every registrant to be sampled, Colorado would still likely have to change, because it still has to be a representative sample. So there's going to have to be some statistical analysis done if USDA accepts that. But it's going to be cost intensive to have to sample every single registrant. And not only that, but they said all hemp. So we don't even know if they would have to then test every lot of every registrant. And then a lot in these rules is actually defined by variety. So you could have multiple varieties in the same fields, and now you've got 4 lots. Well, do these rules mean that the state has to test every single one of those lots? Is it just a representative sample of all lots, or does the state get to choose which registrants it gets to sample? So there is substantial confusion about what the USDA meant in this rule. And I think that guidance and rule clarification are necessary and will be forthcoming.
Alex?
Yep.
Yeah, if I just could weigh in on this one right here, I think it's really interesting in talking with the Colorado Department of Agriculture about this. They estimate that they test and sample on average between 25 to 35, maybe 40% currently. And that's been fairly consistent over the last couple of years. And so from a state perspective, not just from the regulatory burden that this puts on the industry itself, but from a state and regulatory perspective, this is going to have a lot of increased costs that they're going to have to take on in order to support this mandate. So in this way, we can look to some success in the rules being extended in that we know that there are not a number of state regulators saying, hey, we just simply don't have the resources to enforce this as written. And I think that it really aligns with the statement that we're saying from a farming standpoint with all of the other issues, including Mother Nature, that we're contending with, to try to create a bottleneck where farmers can't have their field sampled in time because we don't have a state regulatory infrastructure that has enough testing agents out there doing the work, is really going to dampen the industry at the very farm level. So appreciate you putting all of this together on this one. It's definitely one that we need to make sure everybody's talking about.
Yeah, of course. And like you said, it's putting a major burden on the state to the point where they don't even know if they would be able to, well, I mean, they would have to get another appropriation from the state government to even effectuate the program. And then the second comment that we have is kind of the same issue. The USDA is requiring all labs to test hemp to be DEA registered. And that creates a major issue in states with legal cannabis already, because most states have private labs that are not DEA registered that are testing marijuana and are also set up to test hemp because it's the same plant. So we've asked USDA to limit that to only state regulators having to test through the DEA labs. I know that Colorado doesn't even want to have to test through a DEA lab themselves, so they might be lobbying for a change here too. But in terms of a commercial COA that you're using in your everyday business, that you'll be shipping, putting in your shipments with your smokable hemp or your distillate or isolate, those should not have to be DEA registered labs. Their reasoning was in case the hemp ends up being 0.4% and is actually marijuana, well, that would need to be a DEA registered entity to handle a controlled substance. But that really overlooks the fact that there's state legal cannabis and there's labs testing cannabis, and that's just the reality on the ground. So that's the other issue that we're contending with in these rules, is USDA taking very strong stances on jurisdiction, and this will come up a little later in the presentation as well, and saying, anything above 0.3%, we don't even have jurisdiction over. You have to talk to DEA. That's very problematic. So I'll turn this over to Cindy, but we're trying to get them to soften this DEA registration requirement or remove it entirely.
Yeah, thank you. I would just say that on this, the flip side of what it's doing with the DEA is that there's just simply not enough labs to serve the industry as it exists today. And this, again, will create a bottleneck where you've got products that need to be sampled or fields that need to be sampled, and you're now waiting to simply just make sure that your products are compliant. And that is not something that this industry needs at this time. So opening it up to allow other labs to participate and allow states more flexibility really is the reasonable way for them to go here. Thank you, Alex.
Of course. And I want to address one question that came in about selling biomass that's above 0.3% total THC, and I'm assuming below 0.3% Delta-9 in other states. I would highly recommend, anytime you send any hemp out of state, that it has a COA showing 0.3% or less total THC. Because states are adopting and submitting their state plans, or will be in the first quarter of 2019, plus some states already have total THC, plus the USDA now only recognizes total THC. I think total THC is where you got to be. So it's really important to have a COA that shows that it's less than 0.3% total THC. And then I'll move on to negligence. So I discussed the negligence provision a little bit earlier. If you grow a hemp plant that's above 0.3% total THC and below 0.5% total THC, there's no penalty at all. You just lose your crop. Once you get to 0.5% THC, that's when prosecutorial discretion enters the picture. And they can either say you negligently grew marijuana and it's 1%, 2%, 3% and it's negligence, or they can say you were intentionally growing marijuana under the guise of hemp and it's 10%, 15%, 20%, whatever. Those are the two violations that are available in these rules. So we've asked that they raise that negligence threshold where it starts to 1%. And the reason is because farmers that are growing hemp that ends up testing below 1%, we're not trying to grow marijuana. They're just not. So we don't want local prosecutors to have the discretion to say, oh, you tested 0.6, yeah, we're going to slap you with a culpable violation, report you to the U.S. Attorney General and the Attorney General of your state. Instead, if we can move that to 1% and then create a presumption of negligence, which takes it out of the local prosecutor's hands again, up to 3%. So no negligence until 1%, then it's a presumption of negligence up to 3%. That will protect farmers because the likeliness of hemp going above 3% when you're not trying to grow marijuana is pretty low if you have the correct genetics. And even if it does go above 3%, you would still be able to have your defense that I didn't mean to grow it. If it's 3.5%, I didn't mean to grow hemp. So that's what we're asking. We're just really trying to lessen the potential sanctions on farmers. So it lowers the barrier of entry, just the freaked out factor that, these farmers could potentially face a Controlled Substance Act violation at 0.4%. So, or I guess at 0.5%. So that is not the case. Negligence is the violation. It's not a criminal. It's not criminal up until a culpable violation, but we just want to even protect farmers more under this regime. And that's the reason for our comments. And I'll kick that over to Cindy. Cindy, do you have anything to add on negligence?
No, I think that you said it all. I really don't think that we should be putting people in jail for fields that test at 0.6%. So I'm really happy that we've got this included here.
Great. Commingling. This is an interesting one. They use this word, and I'm going to read these definitions because they're important. So the way they define a lot is a contiguous area in a field, greenhouse, or indoor growing structure containing the same variety or strain of cannabis throughout the area. And then they said that you cannot commingle your lot with other harvested lots without prior written permission from the USDA. And then lots that meet the acceptable hemp THC level may enter the stream of commerce. So this is the USDA plan only, but because states are looking to these rules, it's really important that we get this right. If, for example, you have 4 varieties growing in your fields and you want to harvest them at the same time, what does it mean to commingle? And that is not defined. USDA has not given us any guidance in terms of where they would land on commingling, but we really believe that it needs to be clear that you can dry these lots in the same building. Maybe you have to tag them, maybe you have to separate them by physical space, or just in some way that they're distinguishable, and just make sure that they're distinguishable. But to require, 4 drying facilities would be absolutely impractical. So we just want more clarification on what commingling means. And with that, I'll kick that one over to Cindy as well.
Yeah, thank you. I just think this is another one of those things it seems like a really technical issue, but if not addressed, it's really going to become a bottleneck for the industry in terms of what you can do once you have your product actually tested and harvested out of the field, going into a drying facility, a processing facility. What is the definition of commingling at that point? Making it clear is necessary. I also wanted to address, we did get a question asking how the farmers felt about the 0.5% to 1% threshold and the 1%, 3%. And I did respond just briefly, but the farmers need as much flexibility as possible. So that's really the goal of what we're working toward here. Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, Cindy. So this is probably one of the biggest issues. USDA, so if hemp tests above 0.3%, regardless of the violations, currently it says that it has to be, in the Farm Bill it said disposed, and USDA has taken that to mean DEA destruction to a non-retrievable status. And that is a very, very, very strict way to interpret the word disposal. So we've asked that they provide 1, 2, or 3 options to remediate instead of just destroy this crop. And that allows us, that would allow farmers to save some economic benefit, whether that is removal of THC through processing. So if it's hot, it gets quarantined, it gets sent to processing, and then they test to make sure that on the back end, the 0.3% THC threshold is not exceeded. So that would be one way. The other one would be, I don't know of methods, but I've heard of methods that farmers are using to actually remediate hemp in the field. And I didn't want to prescribe any methods or recommend any methods. So what I've done is I've asked USDA to provide a 30-day remediation period. And finally, if they don't accept either one of those arguments, stalks have always been exempted from the definition of marijuana. So we could potentially have the flower stripped and just stalks remaining and divert the stalks to the fiber market. That would be the least economically viable, but it would still save, you'd still be able to sell your stalks. I mean, it wouldn't be nearly the income that you'd see from a full crop, but it would save at least some money from being completely lost. So we've asked the USDA to step back from that jurisdictional stance just a little bit and not hand anything that's 0.3% and above over to DEA, but allow for remediation to render it compliant before rendering it non-retrievable under DEA rules. So I'll let Cindy jump on that one.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. I honestly think this is one of the most important issues that we have to address, assuming we can, of course, test our fields and ensure that we can get them to a harvest or a processing facility. But, the reality is that we have the technology, we have the ability, and the definition of it per law allows for these definitions. When I was talking again with a program, one of the program directors in Colorado, the feedback that they had gotten directly from the USDA was that they were not going to budge on this one at all. And there was, a question that was just asked here a second ago, which was the 60-day window is too tight. And we absolutely agree. And we think we're making progress because it was just extended. And Alex can speak to that a bit in a minute. But the reality is that we have to make a lot of noise around this issue. There is really no reason why farmers should be having to burn their plants. They are already through definition, if we're able to get, for the negligence raised from 0.5% to 1%, there are already protections in place to keep this from becoming marijuana. This allows the ability for Mother Nature to be Mother Nature and farmers to still be able to adjust within a reasonable way that ultimately ends in any finished product that is released on the street being completely compliant, tested, and below the 0.3%. So we believe that this is a reasonable ask and that the way that they have chosen to interpret a definition that gives them more flexibility than they let on is something that they need to revisit. That's what I've got, Alex, and we appreciate you all being willing to take this and communicate it to the USDA. We would be appreciative.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things we want to encourage everybody on the call or on the webinar today to do is to submit their own comments to USDA, especially if you agree with any of these ones. The more USDA hears about these issues, the more likely they are to change. That's just my view.
Absolutely.
Public pressure works. So the more comments we can get submitted, the more likely we'll have a workable hemp program. All right, so we'll move on to interstate commerce. And I know a lot of you know, even after the Farm Bill, hemp is still getting seized. For example, I believe it was New York City posted on Facebook that they had one of the biggest marijuana busts in the history of the city, and it ended up being 0.25% hemp. So this is a big issue, and USDA did not really address it in the rules. They created an FSA database, and they're saying that all farmers have to submit their lot, their registration number, how much they harvested, and report that all to USDA and the FSA database. However, there's no mechanism for law enforcement to then check that. So we're asking that they just add to this database the ability for producers to import information about transportation and shipments, so that if a semi or a transporter is stopped on the side of the road by law enforcement, that law enforcement, all they have to do is go look at the USDA database and they can verify that shipment, that it's hemp, and let it go on its way. The issue is we do not want it seized and tested and held for 2 weeks, because it can get contaminated, can lose potency. There's a whole host of issues you do not want it seized. It can go missing. Some of my clients have had stuff seized, had it returned, and half of it was missing. So it's really important that we stop the seizures. And that's one thing that we're asking USDA to consider. Another one is asking USDA to even put even a more secure protocol in place, and that's create a tag that you have to tag your shipments with. So when police officers open up a shipment, they see that USDA tag. It has the weight, it has the registration number, and they can verify, and and then the shipment's on its way. So this is one of the most important issues, and I think that the USDA really dropped the ball in addressing it, because without interstate transportation, you don't really have a nationwide hemp market. You don't have a nationwide hemp market. So it's really important that we get this right. Cindy?
Yeah, Alex, I would say that you nailed it. For those of you, I also have clients that have had hemp shipments seized, and it is not a pretty scenario. It ultimately ends with 2 weeks is the best case scenario that I've ever heard of. I had 500,000 pounds of biomass sat in a conservative Wyoming prison for almost 6 months while it waited with every other drug to be tested. And ultimately, they almost arrested the individuals who were driving. We were able to affirm their employment in the hemp industry in Colorado and keep them out of jail. But it was ridiculous. And so if we are able to, through just these simple additions to the FSA, add that in there so that we begin the chain of custody so that it can be verified as compliant hemp, that solves it for everyone right there, instead of each individual state trying to come up with their own solution that doesn't really cross state lines, which is what's happening now, at least in Colorado, and in at least 4 other states that I'm hearing about. They're all trying to come up with their own transportation solution that doesn't really do anything to bridge interstate transportation. To your point, Alex, the USDA is the only jurisdiction that had the ability to do that, and they totally dropped the ball here, and we need to be saying something about it.
Yeah, I fully agree. And I think that this is one of the most important issues there is, because like I said, if you can't trust that you're transporting your hemp across state lines and it's not going to get seized, I mean, yeah, that really inhibits the industry from growth. And
absolutely,
the risk is just massive. So moving on to harvest, the USDA decided to give everybody 15 days from the time they test your field to the time that your field has to be cleared. And as most farmers know, that's impossible. We're still mainly harvesting by hand, just because combines keep breaking down. The newest, greatest machines I've seen have gone down because hemp is resinous and tough. There are some out there that work, but they're expensive. And the reality is not everybody can get their hands on them. So we need the ability to allow farmers to have 30 days to harvest all of their crop. And we don't think that that's unreasonable. Yes, THC might spike a little bit more over that period, but if it's below that 0.3%, it really shouldn't spike all that much more. And additionally, it's just impractical to require farmers to harvest in 15 days when a lot of this is still done by manual labor. So we really ask that, and it's not just us, this is one of the #1 comments that USDA has received, is that harvest time gets increased from 15 days to 30 days. Cindy?
Alex, I think you pretty much covered it with this one. I mean, we're kind of getting into death by 1,000 paper cuts when we start really putting a narrow window on when you can harvest, and it's not cooperating with Mother Nature. There's a lot of different reasons where things can go wrong. So as much flexibility as you can give these farmers in order to have a compliant crop, the better you are.
Fully agreed. All right, so the felony provision, I just wanted to go through. Those are the public comments that we're making. These last two are kind of informational. The final slide we have also is a comment, but it's not something that can be addressed by rule. So the felony provision, because it was statutory, it says any person convicted of a felony related to a controlled substance under state or federal law shall be ineligible to participate in the hemp program established under this section or to produce hemp under any regulations or guidelines issued under section 297D. So USDA could have interpreted this to mean that if you have a controlled substance felony, you do not get to participate in the industry at all, as a worker, as a field manager, at all. They actually limited it to key participants, and they define key participants as owners of a business and then C-suite executives. So that's chief executive officer, chief operating officer, chief financial officer, and their functional equivalents to LLCs, I would read into that as well. So although we can't change this in rule, USDA did a good job limiting this provision already. What I will say is states do have the option to go beyond what USDA did. So they could make that, they could interpret that felon ban to be much more strict than USDA has. And that would be problematic for those states because, as we know, a lot of people who have controlled substance felonies are the ones that know how to grow the hemp. Cutting all of that know-how and knowledge out of the industry is problematic. So especially, on the ground workers. So what I would say is keep an eye out for your state plans to make sure that they're not going any further than the USDA did, and make sure that they've really limited that provision to key participants, to license holders, to owners. And although I would like to see that provision completely removed from the Farm Bill, the reality is the USDA under rulemaking can't do anything about it. We would have to actually remove that provision in statute, likely in the next Farm Bill in 2022 or 2020. Yeah, 2022. So Cindy?
Yeah, I mean, I would call this one a win, and it's probably something that we should put toward the front when we start going after them, because it is the one thing that they did do under what we believe they have the flexibility to do, which is really use their creativity to try to make sure that this is as good as it can be. And so I think that the fact that they created an opportunity for anyone else to still be able to participate in the industry if they had been disenfranchised by the war on drugs prior to legalization is a positive.
The final slide we have for you, and our final comment is on the actual Delta-9 THC percentage in the Farm Bill. Again, this cannot be solved by USDA in rulemaking. This would have to be a statutory change passed by both houses of Congress and signed by the president. We do think that we have a good argument here, though, because the rest of the world, as they're legalizing hemp, they're moving to a 1% standard. And that's seriously disadvantaging American farmers, because we really can't take a lot of our hemp strains to maturity without them spiking over that 0.3%. So we're asking that USDA advocate on behalf of US farmers to put them on an equal footing in global trade with the rest of the world who's now producing hemp as well. So Switzerland, for example, is 1%. I believe Uruguay is 1%. Australia is 1%. I know Europe is 0.2%, and they're looking to move to either 1 or 2%. So if we want to keep up with global trade and continue to be the leader in hemp worldwide, at least not on, I would say China is probably the leader on the fiber side, but at least in terms of the consumable market, we really need to have the ability to grow hemp up to 1% THC, especially because it's total THC. If it wasn't a total THC requirement, this would not be as big of an issue, but because they've defined Delta-9 THC as Delta-9 THC plus THCA, it's really important that we get this percentage increased just so our farmers aren't disadvantaged on the global stage. Cindy?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. And we chose to put this in, again, as Alex said, this is not something that the USDA has the jurisdiction to do on an increased level from a regulatory perspective, but it's really important, especially given the rules that just came out, to keep it in context of the global perspective of what's happening here. If every other country is able to produce a hemp product that has a higher cannabinoid profile a stronger cannabinoid profile than that of what we're able to produce domestically. That means we're going to be importing a ton of hemp into this country that we don't have the same jurisdictional standards over like we do for testing. So everything we're doing here is all for naught if we're bringing it in overseas without the same regulatory oversight requirements that we have. It might be coming in cheaper, but there might be a reason for that. So it's one of those issues where we need them to keep this in context of the global market and understanding that if they want to support what what Congress did when they created the hemp program, then they need to make sure that they're looking at this issue. So we wanted to take the opportunity to make sure that we keep our members here at NCIA educated about the issue and why we're talking about 1%, 0.3%, what that means, what that looks like, all of that. And really wanted to create the opportunity for dialogue around all of these rules, regulations, but ultimately, again, in context of what a viable and successful industry looks like here domestically in line with what's happening with the rest of the world. So thank you, Alex, for lining up all those countries for us too. I keep hearing the same, and it's really interesting when you start hearing them listed like that.
Yeah, and we just received a question about this, and it was from Dylan. To clarify, are you advocating for 1% total THC or Delta-9? Because USDA has defined THC as total THC, we're advocating for 1% total THC. I don't see any way that the USDA is not going to have a total THC standard. And the reality is because a lot of marijuana strains could be included as hemp if it was just Delta-9, because it's not expressed, because Delta-9 THC is not expressed out in the field. And that's why USDA is moving toward that total THC requirement, just like Colorado did 2 or 3 years ago. So we're advocating for 1% total THC, but that's not because we've decided total THC. That's because USDA has taken the position that THC means total THC. So I hope that clarifies that question. All right. And I just want to thank everybody for being on the webinar today. Feel free to reach out to both Cindy and I. Our contact information is included. So I think we're submitting these comments in the next week or two, officially on behalf of NCIA. So that'll be very exciting. And like we said, we really need as many people to submit comments as we can. So we'll send these slides out. Take what you like, send them into USDA. The only way things change is if, a lot of people get involved, and we hope that you will. Cindy?
Yes, thank you so much for giving us your time today. We know that you've got a lot going on, and the reality is it doesn't matter if you're a farmer, it doesn't matter if you're a processor, it doesn't matter if you finish products. Okay, no farmer, no hemp. It's important for us to all get involved. It is great to be a part of these organizations, and we're so grateful to NCIA for giving us the platform and umbrella to organize, to distribute this collective information to you. But it is also important that you as individuals and as businesses reach out to the USDA directly and echo these comments so that they are able to hear from the masses as well as from individual organizations the way that this is going to impact the industry. As I said, we do think that we're making progress. We do believe that, they're only extending the rulemaking period from 60 days to 120, I believe. Alex, you can correct me if I'm wrong on that, but if they're only extending the rulemaking period because they're hearing so much feedback, they can't cut it off this early. So it's really important for them to keep hearing from you. Thank you again for your time, and we look forward to answering any other questions that you might have.
We really appreciate you taking the time to hang with us today and learn a little bit more about the USDA hemp rules.